Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week has been busy with many news items. They range from an admission by Elon Musk that he anticipates there to be a high fatality rate by colonists on the way to Mars. Significant differences in states that have allowed vaccine exemptions in America are beginning to be reconciled. There are long-term side effects to infection by the CCP virus, and increasingly we are recognizing more neurological cases. There's also development of novel new vaccines for things like malaria. You can find timestamps for each of these in the description below. Let's start with the CCP virus. Given that we have now surpassed 150 million global cases of the CCP virus, you would expect us to be able to see a large number of symptoms if they were going to occur. Comparing this to a clinical trial, this is amongst some of the best data you can have. That data shows very clearly that there are neurological symptoms that persist and can in effect be considered a new disease. One of these is acute transverse myelitis. This is an inflammation of the spinal cord leading to pain, paralysis, and sensory problems. Any viral infection that affects the body is likely to have some lingering effect. There have been many other examples, such as anosmia or loss of smell. This particular disease, though, is far more significant and far rarer in the greater population. Normally you'd expect to see somewhere between 1.3 and 4.6 cases per million people, based on different populations. Among those with COVID-19, it's at about 0.5 per million people. While yes, that is less than the general population, it's a significant relationship when you think about just how many people have the CCP virus versus those who are just in the general population. This is where vaccines would normally be touted as the solution. The problem is fundamentally herd immunity, as has been noted in one outbreak associated with a nursing home for the elderly and an unvaccinated worker. The residents of the nursing home were, for the most part, vaccinated. The worker was not. This one employee infected 22 others, and these were fully vaccinated individuals. Understand, this is a facility for the elderly, and they are the group at most risk of infection. As a result of this event, 2 of the residents of the facility died. What is more, among those who were infected, they were nearly all infected by a variant of the CCP virus. This is a variant that makes it more resistant to the vaccines. While that's true, it was also demonstrated that those who had been vaccinated were both less likely to be infected and were less likely to develop symptoms that were concerning. This demonstrates that if you have enough individuals who are vaccinated, you begin to remove the issue of a disease like the CCP virus. You stop the most severe cases and you stop the spread. This should have allowed people to begin returning to some sense of normality. Those who have been vaccinated should be able to go back to their lives with very few limitations. This is not true in Miami. Miami is preventing teachers who have been vaccinated from interacting with their students. These are staff who have effectively been protected from the CCP virus and should have little chance of being infected and greatly reduced chances of spreading it. The argument being put forward for why teachers who have been vaccinated are not allowed to interact with students and are in fact actively being discouraged from doing so is that they believe non-vaccinated people could be negatively impacted by contact with a vaccinated person. This is a completely asinine and arse-backwards argument, and there is no other way to describe it that isn't even more harsh in its tone. This whole debacle can be summarized with one description of it, and that is teachers who wait to get vaccinated after the school year ends will be allowed to return only when clinical trials on the vaccine are completed, assuming a position at the school is still available. Clearly, the owners of this school do not understand that the clinical trials have already been conducted, and continued market monitoring is happening. This monitoring is there to ensure that there are no long-term adverse effects from the vaccine. It's why we know about things like blood clots. The clinical trials that have already been conducted have clearly demonstrated that it is safe and effective. While the owners don't consider themselves anti-vaxxers, they have been known to share anti-vaxxer sentiments on social media and describe themselves as health freedom advocates. Considering what we've described so far, it seems they lean far more towards anti-vaxxer sentimentality than they do towards freedom advocates. They are so concerned and reticent about vaccines that they are advocating and encouraging parents to apply for vaccine exemptions. Nonsense like this is likely why different states in America are looking at cutting out various exemptions to vaccinations. One of these is the religious exemption in Connecticut. Nearly overall, no religion at all has any objection to vaccines in most cases. The few limitations where a vaccine that is considered, for lack of a better word, not suitable under those religious limitations has an alternative that is acceptable. Despite this, many states in America still have an allowance for religious objection. At the moment, at least in Connecticut, there are 7,600 schoolchildren with these exemptions. At the moment, there is a vote which has passed the State House on a 90 to 53 vote that will remove these exemptions beginning in between 2022 and 2023. In other countries, such as the UK, the need for exemptions and removing exemptions is far lower. In fact, in the over 50s age group in England, 95% of individuals have received their vaccine. Admittedly, the next age group, which is 45 to 49, is significantly lower at 59%. Admittedly though, they have only been offered the option of being vaccinated earlier this month. Even among healthcare workers and those working in aged care facilities, there's still an 80% acceptance rate, which is 20% too little, but 15% below herd immunity levels. You can see here from this graph just how effective it has been in helping to curtail the spread when done in conjunction with social distancing and certain other restrictions. We've gone from having thousands of new cases a day and tens if not hundreds of deaths. We have now got down to below 20 a day. This is a huge improvement. While you may yourself have reservations about the efficacy of vaccines and what it protects you from, consider your pets and loved ones with regards to why you should take it. Evidence is increasingly mounting of not only human to animal, but human to animals that are specific to our homes, these being cats and dogs. At least one cat has died recently due to infection by the CCP virus. There are at least several more cases where it appears owners have spread the disease from themselves to their pets, and it has caused harm for their animal. While at present it's not clear that the animal can reinfect a human, it is clear that humans can infect their animals. Going now from CCP virus-related news to investigation into autism and birthing methods. When having a baby, it's not a particularly pleasant experience. The child's head and body is quite large, and the birth canal is rather narrow. As a consequence, it can be extremely painful. Many mothers choose to have an epidural, which removes the pain but allows the birth to go ahead, mostly without complications. The fact that some children are born after epidurals have been administered has led some groups to claim that the epidural can increase the risk of autism. This is a not unreasonable hypothesis, but required evidence to support it. This is where a Canadian study into 120,000 births comes in. It looked at a link between the different types of pain medication and prevalence of autism spectrum disorders. Unlike other research which was published earlier this year, this study accounted for far more of the variables which play into the known prevalence of autism. This included things like having to have a cesarean, the maternal fever, the actual amount of drugs used for anesthesia, and more. These are factors which, in other studies that have made such claims, raised not only the ire of other researchers, but were immediate flags for concern with the studies. Autism is a highly complex condition with many factors and genes coming into play, some more important than others. Skepticism about treatments is fine, but skepticism without the ability to test and analyze results isn't. It simply is fear. The Canadian study used their skepticism, both of the studies that were peddling this fear, but also to figure out how they could better investigate it. In short, they found that there's no association between epidurals and a risk of autism spectrum disorders. They were even able to start comparing siblings, one born with epidurals and the other without, and still no link, and this is as close to a perfect study as you can get without starting to experiment on children being born. No doubt the nutty anti-vaxxers will start peddling something about the implications for the epidural on the mother in the long term, much as they have in the past with the chronic effects of vaccines that somehow or other affect the developing fetus years after they're administered. In good vaccine news, there is a possible highly effective malaria vaccine that's going to be entering clinical trials that have important use. This vaccine has already passed a phase 1 trial. This is fundamentally just a proof of concept trial using healthy volunteers. The phase 2 trial will use a situation in which malaria is a concern and is being run by Oxford University. If successful, this could help to bring malaria under control. Malaria is endemic to various regions throughout the world. It causes premature death in children. It greatly diminishes quality of life. It can cause death in the elderly. There are many reasons why we want to get it under control and if not outright eradicate it. A vaccine program would be one very efficient way of doing this, as it would remove a vector in the humans for it to continue being spread around. The study used about 450 children aged from 5 to 17 months. They gave them differing doses. The highest dose group was 77% less likely to get malaria, 71% in the lower dose group. Having demonstrated some of the efficacy and function in a phase 2 trial which is being published, they're now going to look at a phase 3 trial involving a little under 5,000 children aged between 5 and 36 months. There are some people who will claim that they can treat malaria without needing to rely on medications and similar. And while yes, in some cases, products that are rich in quinine can help, quinine having been used historically as the treatment for malaria, others are peddling far less substantial treatments. This covers not only malaria, but many diseases. The worst of these are those that claim essential oils have healing properties. In many cases, if you either consume them directly, the complete benefit of any essential oil will be undone by the acid of the stomach. If you apply them topically, they won't penetrate the skin, and if they do, they'll begin generating an inflammatory response. This is often in the form of a rash or irritated skin. There are a smaller subset of individuals who take essential oils, and they will experience effects from these, notably seizures. The study comes out of India and is based on a large-scale study with multiple hospitals. They were looking at just who experienced seizure and whether they used things like camphor or eucalyptus essential oils. Their conclusion was that about 15% of the seizures they had records of were caused by either the inhalation, ingestion, or topical use of essential oils. While this study is not the be-all and end-all of research into the topic, and is in fact very much the opposite, it is just the beginning, it is a solid study as it followed up participants for not just a few months, but several years, checking in on them and ensuring that they had not only treated their seizures, but stopped taking essential oils and then ceased their anti-seizure medication, finding that, effectively, the incidence of seizure amongst that group disappeared. The New Age movement includes many things like essential oils as treatments, but also includes other environmental actions, and the environment is where we're going next. It's about microbes and how they could be sequestering large amount of CO2 and taking it out of the tectonic plates. Carbon is used in the human body in the form of glucose, along with oxygen to fuel our generation of ATP. Many microbes don't have access to things like glucose, primarily because of their location, buried deep underground or in the deep ocean where there's no natural light, but there is plenty of thermal energy, and carbon. These two factors could be used to generate energy according to a new study. This is based on the idea that the Earth's energy in the form of heat, plus carbon dioxide and carbon in and of itself, from the deep carbon core of the Earth, could be used by the microbes. This was demonstrated by finding bacteria in hot springs, and a notably different form of carbon, a particular isotope, that showed that they were not only trapping the CO2 coming from the tectonic plate, but that they were using it to grow their own bacteria. In other environmental news, there's been another development in a 142-year-old experiment. An experiment started in 1879 on the grounds of Michigan State University. It's intended to figure out just how long seeds can remain viable underground. The original experiment was roughly designed that one bottle would be dug out of the ground every year. This would establish over time just how viable they were, given that there was approximately 21 species with 50 seeds per plant in each bottle. This would help farmers figure out just how long a seed from a weed could keep growing if fields were plowed and weeded religiously. It turns out they can survive a surprisingly long time. The original person to set up the experiment went by the name of Beale. He retired in 1910, passing it on to another colleague. As the sample set was diminishing, they decided to move it from once every year to once every 5 years, then every 10 years, and now it's once every 20 years. The last sample to be collected was in 2000. At that time, only a few different weed species were still able to sprout, but that's 120 years after they were put into storage. The current is at 142 years, and there are 4 bottles left, which means it will take 222 years for this experiment to come to its conclusion. As it stands now, at least some of these seeds from the current bottle are still germinating. Going now from the environment to technology, and specifically energy technology. There are designs underway to build gravity-based batteries. These are, effectively, giant stores for the potential and kinetic energy that would come from moving a heavy weight up high and letting that heavy weight slowly come down, moving the necessary machinery to generate weight. Doing this would be, in some ways, better than a chemical battery. The ability to store the energy is far easier in a physical object, like a heavy weight moved up high, than it is in a chemical format. For this to happen, we need to look at Edinburgh in the UK. Well, specifically Scotland, but let's not mention that to the English. The design is fundamentally a big tower with a 50-ton weight suspended by cables. This weight is slowly taken up the tower, and now gravity would try to bring that weight back down. The power of gravity pulling it down is the potential energy, and given we're talking about 50 ton of weight, that is a lot of power. The power generated from just the test of it going to half height was 250 kilowatts. The concept and principle behind it are not so different to a hydroelectric dam. Water is pent up behind a wall, and the process of taking it down gradient turns turbines, and this provides electricity. The same fundamental idea behind moving a large weight up to the top of the tower, where it then tries to come down from the tower and in doing so releases its pent-up energy. In other news, Elon Musk has admitted that Tesla made a mistake in calculating how much solar roof would cost. This has led to many purchasers being given very high bills, much higher than they'd initially anticipated. This all comes down to the issue of the roofs involved. Some of these are either more complex or difficult to install with than others. And before now, they've been taking something closer to a one-size-fits-all solution. They now recognize that some roofs are far more complex and difficult than others. While Musk has admitted on one hand that his solar roof plan isn't going quite to plan, he has also announced another project, this time a $100 million prize for carbon removal. It's intended to incentivize people to find ways to take large amounts of carbon out of the air effectively. This is not just on a small scale though. The initial project has to be able to achieve at least 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year and scale up to 1 million tons per year, ideally being able to achieve a scale of gigatons in the future. This is a huge scale, and even our best efforts at present aren't on that level. There are some designs across the world that are meant to take carbon dioxide directly out of the air and use it for various functions or filter it away. These are theoretically great, but they're not economical. After 1 year, 15 submissions will receive $1 million each. This will continue for 4 years. At the end of those 4 years, one submission will receive $50 million and 3 runners-up will receive $30 million. Other Elon Musk news is that he's admitted that, in his words, a bunch of people will probably die during SpaceX's voyage to Mars, countering this by describing it as a glorious adventure and amazing experience. That's certainly one way to sell it, as Musk wants to get humans on Mars by 2026, and that's 7 years before NASA aims to achieve the same result. This isn't exactly the most encouraging news. This will be using the same technology that over the last couple of years has had a rather notorious track record for catching fire, exploding, crashing, and generally not working as intended. Yeah. In other space-related news, there was a interesting article from the Australian National Broadcaster. They were explaining how an astronomer was able to use evidence from an Australian observatory to figure out just where a 1.5 meter meteorite that hit Earth in 2018 had come from in space and allow them to backtrack it even further. That backtracking allowed them to figure out that the asteroid had actually come from the asteroid belt, and one of the largest asteroids that are in the asteroid belt. This is called the Vesta asteroid and is the second largest. The 1.5 meteorite that hit Earth was simply a part of this that was broken off and eventually found its way to Earth over several years. In other space news, and going back to Mars temporarily, Ingenuity has been able to spot Perseverance, one of the previous probes sent to Mars, during one of its flights, in fact during its third flight. While suspended in Mars's very poor atmosphere, it was there for quite some time, and its achievement is impressive, but also seeing the evidence of past attempts to explore the red planet are interesting. Finally, news on SpaceX's reusable Crew Dragon capsules. The idea behind SpaceX has been to create a reusable system that would be cheaper than launching new rockets. They have a history of, while testing these, of hiccups, and this has led to concerns about their reusability. Will they still be both effective, reliable, and safe after the first launch? The current launch proves that at least in this instance they are. The Crew Dragon capsule docked with the space station and unloaded its crew, these being several NASA astronauts, a Japanese astronaut, and a European Space Agency astronaut. This does leave the ISS to now have 5 more crew on board than they have beds, but they're able to set up in various ways. The 2 captains of the various crew capsules have taken up residence in those. The 3 other members who still need to find somewhere to sleep have occupied the gym, laboratory module, and airlock. The advantages of the crew capsule are that it can hold 1 more crew member than the Soyuz system, which is what Russia was delivering astronauts to space with, while NASA set out its own solution. It's also rather cheaper than the Soyuz system. This means more equipment, more people, and in theory, more often. That's all the news we have for you this week. If you all found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.